Now we're going to move to Erika Harper, who's going to bring the experience of Jordan and talk about economic resilience for host communities and refugees.
Can everyone hear me? Great. Thank you firstly to the organisers for inviting me here. As a fairly new organisation, one is just going into its third year. It's a great privilege to be asked to share our work and our ideas. Apologies that seem to be the only one who's not using a PowerPoint. At the end of last year, when we did our roundup of our work in 2015, one of the observations we had is that our fellows, who we try to get them to speak a lot, they seem to be doing these amazing PowerPoints and things that jump out and go bang and all these crazy things. But one thing we really observed was that no one was listening to them. They were just reading the PowerPoints. So they're now on a 6-month ban. And that's to kind of encourage them to really think about what they're saying and to engage with their audience. And of course, when I was preparing to come here, they said that the same rule should extend to me. So I'm going to try. Hopefully what I'll say will be interesting enough. So I've been asked to speak about a research project that the Institute started almost exactly a year ago. And at that time, at the end of 2014, the Syrian refugee crisis has reached a tipping point in terms of numbers being accommodated, clear signs of economic externalities, and the first stages of a phenomenon that everyone in the humanitarian community is familiar with, donor fatigue. So my staff had been studying these dynamics for quite some time alongside a team that was working on regional migration policy and another team that was looking at Jordan's macroeconomic challenges. Now, the genius of these kinds of interdisciplinary approaches is that sometimes you come up with really new and innovative ideas. And innovation, even though it seems to be the latest catchphrase, it's actually a lot more rare and a lot more difficult than we think it is. There's a lot of really smart people working in the humanitarian and development sectors, and we still really struggle to come up with strategies that ultimately engage policymakers and change the status quo. So what we came up with at the time was really pretty provocative. At a time when Jordan's principal economic policy was about cutting back on migrant workers and replacing them with national jobs to counter rising unemployment, we said do the opposite and do it at a really large scale. Create jobs for non-nationals and use the non-nationals, the ones that you least want to stay and integrate, refugees. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the story, but how this happened, and it's a bit of an interesting story because not only because of what it might tell us about future refugee policy, but also in terms of how sometimes the best way to get policy change is to avoid political discussions altogether. And because a lot of the people here are from either knowledge-generating organisations or think tanks, I'll talk a little bit about promoting evidence uptake among policymakers, because this is the really hard one, right? How do you make your ideas palatable and tangible for the people that really have the power to turn them into reality? So because I've got to condense a year's work into about 15 minutes, let's cut straight to what Jordan's economic picture looked at a year ago. If you look at what Jordan's aiming for, the best analogy is probably Singapore. It's also a small, resource-scarce state, but it's one that's managed to make the leap to become a high-tech, knowledge-exporting, wealthy economy. Jordan started off really well by investing heavily in education, but it hasn't been able to quite make that Singapore leap. Hasn't been able to overcome factors like neighbourhood, small coastline, and just a bit of bad luck with timing as well. Singapore's rise can't be dissociated from the rise of the Asian economic tigers. So at the end point, what has happened is that it's become trapped in middle income status. Few states have risen out of this trap without a strong industrial manufacturing sector. And again, Jordan's done all the right things. It's invested heavily and strategically in economic zones and free trade zones, the kinds of sectors it wants to grow to stimulate the production of high value-added exports. The investment didn't come at a rate that was needed for Jordan to establish what's called a manufacturing cluster. Here, we need to appreciate the enormity of the challenge. So to be profitable, sectors tend to congregate geographically. It's called spatial economies of scale. It's hugely costly for companies to set up clusters. So Jordan, a place like Jordan, it's got to offer really, really good terms and conditions. So the zones are good, but companies also take into account things like market access, water, regional stability, and a low-cost, plentiful, semi-skilled labour force. And this one was probably the draw card. Jordan's investment in education meant that the types of jobs that large-scale manufacturing tends to attract were not the kinds that young Jordanians were aspiring towards. At the same time, as in the case of Lebanon, since 2011, Jordan has taken in thousands of refugees. There's contestation around the actual number, but suffice to say, in both countries, it's a lot. This situation becomes more problematic as it becomes protracted and donor fatigue sets in. And there was fairly reliable economic evidence that refugees were impacting the economy, particularly in terms of an inflation in the informal sector. Perhaps even more important than the actual economic effects was the perception that refugees were damaging the economy. I'm sure it was the case here as well. Stolen jobs, overcrowding, waning social cohesion. These were almost daily media headlines, and the government takes notice of that. So this was all very curious to us. The economics told us that Jordan would benefit from high value-added manufacturing. To do this, it needed to attract much higher foreign investment. Didn't want to import the labour. The National Employment Strategy had set out a clear plan to replace migrants with Jordanians. But we had this large refugee population that was causing all of these worrying economic impacts. So we teamed forces with two professors at Oxford University, Alexander Betts, who has already been mentioned, and Paul Collier. And this was really helpful. Paul's probably the world's second or third best conflict economist, and what country doesn't want someone like that coming in and getting engaged and giving free advice? Paul didn't have a political agenda, but even for those who suspected that he probably did, they knew that his recommendations brought along with them the World Bank, DFID, other massive IFIs, EBRD, all to name just but a few. When we got down to work, we saw that what it boiled down to was that for Jordan to establish a strong manufacturing sector, it needed something more, it needed something different. And what did it have that was more and different? It had refugees, and it had stability in a pretty unfriendly neighbourhood. So was this going to be enough to overcome these factors that had up until then been dissuading investment? Paul thought the answer was probably yes, if we could pitch it as a sufficiently good profit opportunity. And we thought that there were three types of interested investors. The first, those that saw a profit opportunity in marketing the sale of safe goods manufactured by refugees, allowing them to earn a livelihood while they were sheltering from conflict. You can imagine the creative marketing that would kind of hone in on consumers' complex feelings about refugees, particularly in Europe, wanting to help but not wanting to host them at the same rates as countries like Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan. Second, companies forced to leave Syria that want to resume operations. So Benetton, Lafarge, Roche, Caterpillar, Sony, they all had very profitable enterprises before 2011. And third, companies looking to position themselves prior to an anticipated post-conflict reconstruction boom. So the model we came up with was large-scale manufacturing that would employ some ratio of Syrian and Jordanian labour. And here comes the genius. Jordan wouldn't have to shelter refugees permanently for the economics to work. Modern companies quickly and easily decant. So the idea was when the situation was right, they would resume operations that expand back into Syria and they'd take their skilled, employed workforce with them. But plant would remain in Jordan. It's expensive to move plant. So Jordan's now established itself as a safe and profitable place to do business. It's got its cluster. The hard work is done. Jordan was going to have to give some form of working rights. That was the only way that this was going to work. But as politically unappealing as that was at the time, we didn't think it was that bad compared to what was on offer. And this was going to create white-collar jobs as well, the types that young Jordanians were better prepped for. So we ran some numbers using time series data, and they look pretty interesting, and they were interesting enough to kind of tweak the interest of some pretty senior members in government, in UNHCR and at the World Bank. Most people are aware of what's happened since then. In February, world leaders, host states, humanitarian agencies came together in London and pledged unprecedented support for more tangible, more practical solutions to this refugee crisis. In return for promising to create 200,000 work opportunities for Syrian refugees, Jordan got $700 million and another $700 million for the 2 years after this one. Critically, a plan for easing EU rules of origin was mapped out, and it got 1.9 billion in low-cost and no-cost loans. These loans were really hard for Jordan to access because of its middle income status. So, was this good or bad? Was it a sellout to Europe who didn't want refugees? Is it going to work? These are all really legitimate questions, and these events have caused a lot of confusion and concern. But lack of clarity around the plan and what it has to offer is probably the biggest thing obscuring its potential to work right now. Where it's possibly good to start is mapping out everybody's interests, because this wasn't just about refugees, and certainly all players had vested interests. But that doesn't automatically mean that it's a bad plan, and it also doesn't automatically mean that ultimately it's not going to help the refugee situation. So let's be clear. Europe's heavy involvement was clearly related to their own refugee and migrant crisis. They had to act. They had to do something to stop the flow of refugees irregularly coming into the country. And the reason they were coming to Europe was because there was no opportunities for them in host states. Did they have to do so much? Probably not. They just cut a really big deal with Turkey that probably would have got them most of what they wanted. So Jordan and Lebanon, walking into the debates last month, they were at a significant disadvantage. Luckily, the players around the table weren't completely short-sighted. As I said, there was other stuff going on. They had two further objectives in mind, and understanding these is really important if this is going to work. The first thing they were interested in is building regional resilience to conflict. Now, there's a lot of complex evidence around this, some of which Paul and I have been working together over the last 10 years. I'm going to try and summarise my thinking on it as it pertains to this situation. Internationalised wars are largely a thing of the past. The type of conflict that the 21st century is going to be remembered for is civil conflict. They're going to happen in poor countries and, to a certain extent, middle-income countries. But rich countries, they don't go to war on each other anymore, and they don't go to war on themselves. There are four really scary things about this war, these kinds of wars. They recur at alarmingly high rates, around 40%, and it's slightly higher in this region. They're costly. They last for around 7 years, and conservative estimate is that they cost around $20 billion. They have global spillover effects, disease, transnational crime, terrorism, and they spread. Conflict contagion is an evidential phenomenon. It means if your neighbour is at war, you are at greater risk of falling into conflict yourself. So what do governments do? People hate talking about statistics at this point because wars involve humans and personalities and so many things that are very personal, but we're not doing a really good job of keeping the peace. So I'll talk a little bit about what the evidence tells us we should be doing as opposed to what we actually do. 6 things seem to increase the risk of conflict statistically. Wealth matters. Low incomes, low growth countries are very much at high risk of conflict. Natural resources matter. Having them is bad. Religious and ethnic diversity also seems to increase the risk. 4th, having a high proportion of young men in the population. So that means high growth states, and a lot of them are in this region. Size, bigger seems to be worse again. We don't really know why. And the big one, having a conflict, it dramatically increases your risk of having another one. So for countries like Jordan and Lebanon, there's not much that can be done about these except for the first, growth in incomes, and I'm going to come back to this. But the key thing is that because conflicts recur at such a high rate, that they cost so much and that they spread, the most effective way to protect against civil war today is by maintaining a post-conflict peace. There's also evidence on how to do this. Type of polity and elections do matter. The evidence is quite disturbing, and people from Western liberal democracies don't usually like talking about it. So if anyone wants to know more, you can come and see me when I'm done. More positively, peacekeeping works. It's unpopular and it's expensive, but it does seem to have protective effects. And again, well, lower the incomes, lower the growth, the more likely your conflict is going to recur. So when we take this all together, it means that if we're really serious about global peace, we need to prioritise security support and policies that raise economic growth and create jobs. We don't need to think about post-conflict security support just yet, but when the time comes, we should. But supporting a post-conflict Syrian economy can start now by building opportunities for Syrians in host states, opportunities that can be taken back to Syria quickly, and by creating opportunities and incentives for companies that are going to do the reconstruction and create jobs when that time comes. I don't need to tell anyone in this room about the physical reconstruction needs that war creates. It's horrific. And I also don't need to tell anyone about the stimulus effects that post-conflict reconstruction can induce. But if it's going to be done in a way that's truly going to assist Syria and Syrians in keeping the peace, we need to start thinking about it sooner than when the time comes. Economic and growth and jobs, it does seem to protect, but macroeconomic recovery after a peace agreement takes about 2 to 3 years to really kick in. And those first 3 years, they're the vulnerability years. So we need to start now. The second thing that these smart people in London were thinking about was about resilience of Jordan and other host states like Lebanon. Again, this is bigger than the European refugee crisis. It's bigger than the Syrian refugee crisis. Europe and the World Bank, they're worried about the next crisis. So this is about giving Jordan and others opportunity to climb out of that middle income trap and build more resilient, more vibrant, more stimulating economies. And these are the important driving factors that the people who are talking about stolen jobs and a sellout to Europe, it's what they're missing. It's not journalists that are just the culprits here. I've heard some really disturbing observations from donors, even as recently as last week, suggesting that Jordan is trying to capitalise on this crisis to build itself a manufacturing industry. Of all the ridiculous things that I've heard about this plan, and there have been a lot, this one takes the cake. Jordan will capitalise, make no mistake, as will Lebanon, as will Turkey. But to capitalise, to take this, get over this enormous feat, it's one opportunity to build itself a vibrant, productive, profitable, stable manufacturing sector. And it's not just good, that's great. And it's great for everybody because this is going to improve Jordan's resilience to conflict. We'll just go through the evidence again. Natural resources. Jordan doesn't have any, so that doesn't matter. Diversity and size, you can't do much about these. Young men in the population. This is a significant risk factor, so I would be thinking about ways to get them into jobs. And the big one, wealth. Let's raise strategies that promote jobs and stimulate economic growth. Vis-a-vis the cost of conflict, when you take into account the 20 billion and recurrence and contagion, the price of better managing this conflict, it's a bargain. And I think that's more what London was about than anything else. Do I have 1 minute?
Less.
Less? Okay, all right. I'll quickly, can I just quickly go through what Jordan and Lebanon should do next? 30 seconds, okay. It's got to mobilise this opportunity. It's got to market these countries as open for business. When I think open for business, I don't think Jordan. So they've got to do stuff about that. You know, in easing the investment framework, making it more investor friendly. Jordan can say that it's friendly to investors until it's blue in the face. Does not make it so. It's got to make quick moves there. It's got to use these opportunities strategically. Business as usual is not an option. They've got to use those loans to offset plant development. They've got to use the pledges to stimulate local jobs and innovation. And it should be considering itself as a reconstruction hub. How does it do that? Prior to something happening in Syria, as far off as the solution might appear, this war will end. And when it does, both countries are ideally approximated geographically, linguistically, culturally, to lead that massive effort that's going to follow. Okay, I didn't think it was possible I was going to speak for 20 minutes, but obviously I have. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Erika.